On the evening of October 24th, 1929, a party was taking place on the 42nd floor of a Park Avenue building that did not officially exist. The guests arrived through a service entrance, guided by a doorman who knew their faces but would never learn their names. They rode a private elevator that bypassed the lobby entirely, ascending into a world that had been specifically designed to pretend the 18th Amendment had never been ratified. The champagne that evening was Dom Perignon, smuggled through Canada at a cost of approximately $400 per case, the equivalent of 8 months' rent for an average Manhattan apartment. The host, a steel magnate whose fortune had tripled since the war, had purchased 60 cases for the occasion. By morning, that same man would be standing on the ledge of his office window, 23 floors above Wall Street, contemplating whether the $12 million he had lost in a single day was sufficient reason to step forward into the empty air. This is the story of the Roaring Twenties, not the jazz age fairy tale of flappers and freedom, but the decade-long binge that ended in the most spectacular collective hangover in American history. It is the story of how Prohibition, designed to make America sober, instead created the most intoxicated ruling class the nation had ever seen. And it is the story of what happens when an entire generation of wealthy Americans convinced themselves that the laws of economics, like the laws of alcohol, simply no longer applied to them. The 18th Amendment went into effect on January 17, 1920, and within approximately 72 hours, the American upper class had transformed lawbreaking into a competitive sport. The first speakeasies were crude affairs, basement operations with sawdust floors and bathtub gin that could strip the enamel from your teeth. But the wealthy had no intention of slumming with the masses. Within months, an entirely parallel economy of luxury prohibition had emerged, catering exclusively to those who could afford to break the law in style. The economics were simple and brutal. A bottle of pre-war French champagne that had cost $20 in 1919 now commanded $300 on the black market. Scottish whiskey, smuggled through Canada and the Caribbean, sold for $50 a bottle, roughly what a factory worker earned in a month. For the wealthy, these prices were not obstacles, but features. Prohibition had transformed alcohol from a commodity into a status symbol. The social mathematics were elegant. If everyone could afford to drink, drinking proved nothing. But if a single evening's entertainment cost more than an automobile, then the guest list became a statement about who mattered and who did not. This was the birth of what historians would later call conspicuous illegality, the practice of demonstrating wealth not merely through consumption, but through the public violation of laws that only the poor were expected to follow. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Whitneys, families whose grandfathers had built the Gilded Age, now competed to host the most elaborate illegal gatherings. The invitations were hand-delivered by servants who had been carefully vetted. The locations changed weekly, moving between private residences, yacht clubs, and the penthouses of buildings whose owners had been persuaded, through various financial arrangements, to develop sudden problems with their elevator inspection records. But it was not enough to simply drink expensive alcohol and expensive rooms. The true currency of the era was the appearance of effortless transgression, the suggestion that one moved through a world where ordinary rules had been suspended by some combination of wealth and breeding. The parties developed their own rituals. Guests were expected to arrive in evening dress, as if attending the opera. The illegal bars were stocked with crystal glassware and silver service. Orchestras played while guests danced among waiters carrying contraband champagne. It was all designed to send a single message: "We are not criminals, we are aristocrats, and this is simply what aristocrats do." By 1925, the Manhattan skyline had become a vertical geography of illegal drinking establishments, each floor representing a different stratum of social acceptability. At street level, the working class made do with whatever swill the local bootlegger could provide: industrial alcohol cut with water and flavored with juniper berries, the famous bathtub gin that blinded an estimated 10,000 Americans over the course of the decade. But 30, 40, 50 floors above the streets, a different kind of establishment had evolved. These were the penthouse speakeasies, exclusive clubs that operated in the uppermost floors of Manhattan's newest skyscrapers, accessible only to those whose wealth and social position placed them beyond the reach of ordinary law enforcement. The most famous was the Mayfair Club, which occupied the top 3 floors of a building on East 57th Street. The entrance was through a working dental office. Guests would walk past the receptionist, through a door marked "private," and into an elevator that ascended into what contemporaries described as a palace floating above the city. The Mayfair served exclusively imported liquors: French champagne, Scottish single malt, Caribbean rum aged in oak barrels. The food was prepared by a chef who had been lured from the Paris Ritz with a salary larger than that of the building's architect. The membership fee was $10,000 annually, approximately $160,000 in today's currency, and the waiting list stretched to more than 300 names. But the Mayfair was merely the most visible peak of an entire mountain range of illegal luxury. Across Manhattan, similar establishments operated in plain sight, protected by a web of corruption that extended from beat cops to federal judges. The 21 Club, which still exists today, was then an underground operation on West 52nd Street, famous for its elaborate security systems. A complex arrangement of levers and pulleys allowed the bar to be swept clean of evidence within 30 seconds of a police raid. The liquor bottles would tumble down a chute into the city's sewers, while the bartenders produced legitimate soft drinks, and the guests assumed expressions of innocent confusion. But raids at establishments like the 21 were rare, and almost always the result of some failure in the regular payment schedule. The standard arrangement was simple: 10% of gross receipts to the local precinct captain, with additional considerations for federal agents and prosecutors as required. One speakeasy owner later testified that his annual protection payments exceeded $40,000, but his profits were sufficient that this represented a minor operating expense. The guests at these establishments understood perfectly well that they were participating in a corrupt system. They simply did not care. The corruption was, in fact, part of the appeal, proof that they inhabited a world where money could purchase exemption from the petty inconveniences of democracy. The most remarkable transformation of the Prohibition era was not the criminalization of alcohol, but the socialization of criminals. Before 1920, a bootlegger was a backwoods criminal, a moonshiner operating out of Appalachian hollows, beneath the notice of respectable society. By 1925, the most successful bootleggers had become celebrities, invited to the same parties where their products were consumed, treated as exotic additions to the social calendar. The wealth involved was staggering. Arnold Rothstein, the financier who essentially industrialized bootlegging on the East Coast, accumulated a fortune estimated at $50 million, roughly $1 billion in today's currency. Bill McCoy, whose rum-running operations gave rise to the phrase "the real McCoy," became so famous that society matrons competed to have him attend their gatherings. But the most successful bootleggers understood that wealth alone was insufficient. They needed to acquire the markers of legitimacy that would transform them from criminals into colorful characters. They hired publicists, they donated to charities, they purchased boxes at the opera and seats at the most exclusive restaurants. They married their daughters into respectable families who were sufficiently impoverished to overlook the source of the dowry. The process worked both ways. The established families of the Gilded Age, families whose own fortunes had often originated in practices that would be considered illegal by later standards, proved remarkably willing to accept the new criminal aristocracy into their social circles. There was a reason for this tolerance beyond mere social climbing. The bootleggers provided something that the old money families desperately wanted: the appearance of vitality, of relevance, of connection to the modern world. The Astors and Vanderbilts had made their fortunes in the 19th century through railroads and shipping and real estate. The bootleggers represented the 20th century, the age of speed, of risk, of fortunes made overnight through nerve and audacity. At the parties that mixed old money with new crime, something strange began to happen. The bootleggers learned to affect the manners of the aristocracy, the understated suits, the discreet conversation, the studied indifference to money. And the aristocracy learned to adopt the bootleggers' attitude toward law, the casual assumption that rules existed for other people, that enforcement was simply a matter of insufficient resources. It was a marriage of convenience that would prove disastrous for both parties. The bootleggers acquired social legitimacy just in time for their industry to be destroyed by repeal, and the old money families acquired an attitude toward risk that would serve them catastrophically when the bills came due. The speakeasies were not merely places to drink. They were temples to a new theology, the Church of Eternal Prosperity, where the faithful gathered to celebrate the miracle of wealth that had no apparent limit. Between 1920 and 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average rose from approximately 100 to 381, an increase of nearly 400%. Stock prices that had once seemed extravagant became bargains as the market continued its apparently endless ascent. Men who had invested modestly in 1920 found themselves millionaires by 1927, paper fortunes that seemed to materialize from nothing. The speakeasies became the spaces where this new wealth was consecrated, where the faithful gathered to confirm each other's delusions. The conversations were always the same. A broker would mention a tip he had received about RCA or General Electric. Someone would recall how much they had made on a similar tip the previous month. The champagne would flow, and by the end of the evening, everyone present would have committed to investments that their sober selves might have questioned. The leverage was extraordinary. By 1929, it was possible to purchase stocks with only 10% down, meaning that a 10% decline would wipe out your entire investment, while a 10% gain would double your money. The arithmetic was seductive, and in the champagne haze of the penthouse speakeasies, the possibility of decline seemed to belong to another universe entirely. The wealthy told themselves stories to explain their good fortune. They were smarter than their fathers. They were bolder than the Europeans. They had access to information that ordinary investors could not obtain. The market was not gambling. It was a meritocracy, and their success proved their merit. None of these stories were true. What they actually had was access to a temporarily favorable set of circumstances that they mistook for a permanent condition. The Federal Reserve had kept interest rates low throughout the decade, making borrowed money cheap. European nations, devastated by war, were purchasing American goods on credit. New technologies, radio, automobiles, electrical appliances, had created genuine economic growth that investors extrapolated into fantasy. But mostly what they had was each other. The penthouse speakeasies functioned as echo chambers, spaces where doubt was social suicide. Anyone who questioned the market's trajectory was dismissed as a pessimist, excluded from the next round of tips, quietly dropped from the invitation lists. By 1929, the American upper class had convinced themselves that they had discovered perpetual motion, an economic machine that generated wealth indefinitely, requiring nothing but their own continued belief. They were drinking champagne on a scaffold, congratulating themselves on the view, and nobody wanted to look down. Thursday, October 24th, 1929, began like any other day on Wall Street. The opening bell rang at 10 o'clock. The trade-in floor filled with the usual cacophony of shouted orders and ringing telephones. By noon, it was clear that something was different. The selling had begun gradually, as it always did. A few large orders that triggered automatic sell orders, which triggered more selling, which triggered more. But this time, the buying that usually absorbed the selling failed to materialize. The ticker machines, which printed stock prices on paper tape, fell further and further behind the actual trades. By 1 o'clock, the ticker was running nearly an hour late, and the men on the trading floor could not tell whether they were ruined or merely damaged. They sold blindly, desperately, hoping to escape positions that might already be worthless. The news reached the speakeasies by mid-afternoon. The parties that had been planned for that evening were not canceled, nothing so gauche, but the champagne remained in its cases. Guests arrived in evening dress and stood in small groups, speaking quietly, watching the door for news. The telephone rang constantly. The news was always bad. By the close of trading, nearly 13 million shares had changed hands, a record that would stand for decades. The Dow Jones had fallen 33 points, erasing approximately $5 billion in paper wealth in a single day. But Thursday was merely the overture. The true catastrophe arrived the following Tuesday, October 29th, Black Tuesday, when the market lost another 30 points and the total destruction reached levels that seemed impossible. Men who had been millionaires at breakfast found themselves penniless by dinner. Fortunes that had taken generations to accumulate evaporated in hours. The margin calls went out, demands for additional collateral that investors could not possibly provide, and the forced selling accelerated the decline in a vicious spiral that seemed to have no bottom. The suicides began that same week. The popular image of bankers leaping from windows is largely mythological. Most took their lives more privately, with pills or gas or the family pistol. But the deaths were real enough. A police blotter from late October records the death of a Chicago speculator who shot himself in his office, leaving a note that read simply, "I cannot face my family." The speakeasies emptied overnight. The champagne that had cost $400 a case went unsold. The orchestras disbanded. The elaborate security systems designed to protect against police raids protected instead against creditors. One survivor later described the experience. On Tuesday, I was worth $3 million. By Friday, I owed more than I had ever possessed. The change was so sudden that I could not make my mind accept it. I kept thinking there must be some mistake, that surely the numbers would correct themselves by morning. They did not correct themselves. The Dow continued to fall for nearly 3 years, eventually bottoming at 41 points in July 1932, a decline of 89% from the peak. Fortunes that had seemed eternal proved to have been mirages, conjured from leverage and optimism and the peculiar group psychology of men who had convinced each other they were gods. The hangover lasted a decade. By 1932, 1/4 of the American workforce was unemployed. Banks had failed by the thousands. The agricultural economy had collapsed. Dust storms were stripping the topsoil from the Great Plains. The families who had danced in the penthouse speakeasies found themselves in positions their grandparents would have recognized, selling jewelry to pay the butcher, dismissing servants they had employed for decades, quietly moving from mansions to apartments to boarding houses. The prohibition that had created their illegal playground was repealed in December 1933, a bitter irony for those who had spent fortunes on smuggled champagne that could now be purchased legally for a fraction of the black market price. The bootleggers fared little better. Arnold Rothstein had been murdered in 1928, shot over a gambling debt. Bill McCoy spent time in federal prison and died in modest circumstances. The criminal enterprises that had seemed so glamorous in the 20s proved to be as fragile as the legitimate fortunes they had paralleled. What remained was a generation marked by the experience of having everything and losing it. They would spend the rest of their lives haunted by the memory of champagne and possibility, by the knowledge that they had been present at the greatest party in American history and had failed to understand that the music was about to stop. The Roaring Twenties exist in American memory as a golden age, a decade of jazz and flappers and youthful exuberance. But this mythology obscures the darker truth. The 20s were a binge, not a celebration. The champagne was stolen, the prosperity was borrowed, and the bill, when it came, was paid not by those who had enjoyed the party, but by their children and grandchildren, who inherited nothing but the debt. The speakeasies are gone now. The buildings that housed them have been renovated, repurposed, occasionally demolished. The wealthy still gather in private clubs on high floors, still drink expensive champagne, still convince themselves that the rules that govern ordinary people do not apply to them. The lesson of the 20s is simple, and it has never been learned. Gravity applies to everyone. The only question is when the floor gives way.